Hey everybody, welcome back to One Seed, One World. In the kitchen today. It's supposed to be pretty hot out. But I've got a lot of preserving to do. Canning, baking, dehydrating, freezing, those kind of things. So I'm gonna get caught up on that today. And since I'm doing that, I figured I'd cover a couple of tips on preserving your tomatoes. So when your tomatoes are getting ripe in the garden and coming in, they're not always, all that ripening isn't always going to coincide with the time that you have to get them canned or put away before they start going bad. In the past, I've had so many baskets of tomatoes that I've lost because I would pick them because they were all ripe, but then I was working full time, come home in the evening and wouldn't feel like canning until midnight to try it. So I'd say, oh, I'll do it this weekend. I'll do it this weekend. Well, by the time the weekend had rolled around, half the tomatoes had already gone rotten. And so I would lose a lot of tomatoes like that. However, what I do now and what you can do is you can freeze your tomatoes until you're ready to get to them. So that is one method of preserving your tomatoes. You don't even have to can them. Last year, I don't think I canned any tomatoes last year. I put them all in freezer bags and froze them at that point, it was with the intent of canning them later when I had a chance. I never got around to it. And we would just use them straight out of the freezer instead of, out of a canning jar. Works the same way. So a couple things about freezing tomatoes is, let me show you here. All right, so when you're freezing your tomatoes, you can just put them in bags, right? These are gallon bags. And these I took out of the freezer yesterday, and they still have a little bit of ice and stuff in there because they were in the refrigerator overnight. But when you freeze them, basically what you want to do, wash them off first, core them, cut out any bad spots, throw them in a freezer bag, put them in the freezer. And then you can either take them out and thaw them when you're ready to use them, or take them out to thaw them to can them, which is what I'm doing today. The cool thing about it is that as they thaw, the skins come off really easily. So you don't have to do that blanching first to get the skins to come off before you cook them and can them and all that kind of thing. It skips a step, kinda. So let me show you how that works. So here is the tomato that has come out of the freezer bag. Look. Skin just peels right off. And you see how I had already cored out the center before I had put it in the freezer bag. So now all the skin's off, just put it in my pot. So that's one quick, easy preserving method for tomatoes, is freezing. Now the one thing that you do have to remember is that if you were to lose your electricity, then your tomatoes are going to be in jeopardy of being lost if you lost electricity for any extended period of time. So this might not always be the best long-term method for preserving, but it can certainly save you in a pinch. And like I said, I actually didn't can anything last year. I froze all my tomatoes. One other thing you can do, you can save these tomato skins. Put them in your dehydrator, dehydrate them down till they're super crispy dry, then grind them into a powder, and you can make your own tomato powder, which then you can put in like chili or soup or other dishes where you want to beef up the tomato flavor, but not necessarily use a whole bunch of tomatoes. It's a more concentrated flavor. And throw in a few tablespoons, kind of whatever you want to do. But dried tomato skins ground into powder, another great way to use the whole part of the fruit. So besides freezing, which you can do permanently for the season, or you can just freeze them and to give you enough time to can, like I mentioned. Then, of course, the next method would be canning. I'm spinning this around because I'm filling up the jars with water first. I found that if I just put the water in the pot itself, as the water level comes up, all the jars start to float and bob around. So I fill up my jars first. Also, if you have hard water, like a lot of calcium in your water, and do not have a water softener, you can always put in, like a cup or so of distilled vinegar in the water when you're heating up your jars to sanitize them. And that will prevent you getting jars that are all streaky white. When we first moved into this house, we did not have a working water softener. And the first batch and I didn't realize this, and the first batch of tomatoes that I ever canned, all the jars were just streaked white and just awful looking, and so I ended up taking them out, re-washing the jars, and redoing them all again. We since have a water softener that was installed, but I still just go ahead and just add some vinegar to the water anyway, just in cases. But that will prevent any streakiness in your jars, getting all that, calcium mess left over. So, with the water bath canning, I always, even though these jars have been washed, I still will put them in this pot first and heat them up. And even bring them to a boil for 5 or 10 minutes just to help sanitize them. But also, you want to pack your hot tomatoes into hot jars before you start canning. If your jars are cold, when you fill them with, if your jars are cold, you fill them with hot tomatoes and then stick them in a hot boiling pot of water, you run the risk of your jars breaking from the shock of the heat. Even though these jars are tempered glass, but they can still bust on you if you are going from extreme cold to extreme hot. So heat up your jars, even if they've been washed. It just helps with the sanitation process, and then also will prevent breakage from extreme temperature changes. I gotta get this on the stove. Ugh. Okay, so I'm not going through all of the, a complete walkthrough on water bath canning tomatoes. Just a couple of things on what I do. I bring up my pot of tomatoes on the stove to a boil. And then once they've started boiling, I don't really leave them on there for any particular amount of time. I just start then filling my jars. In my jars, before I put the tomatoes in, I add 2 tablespoons of bottled lemon juice and 1 teaspoon of sea salt. I've done that forever. I think that's what my mom used to do. That's probably where I learned it from. The lemon juice, if you are a new canner, can help increase the acidity. It doesn't change the flavor of your tomatoes. It just basically helps increase the acidity so you have a appropriate pH level for water bath canning, so you don't get all the potential for botulism in there. You might not get it anyway. I mean, there's people that I think can without using lemon juice. But there's all different varieties of tomatoes, and their acidity level in the tomatoes will be different depending on the variety, depending on the season, even from one tomato to another, what the ripeness of your tomato, the type of weather you had. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can affect how acidic each tomato is. So throwing a little bit of lemon juice in there will just help balance it out and make sure that it's at a good pH level for your canning. And then I water bath can for about 40 to 45 minutes. That also will vary depending on where you're at for sea level, the length of time that you have to do it. So if you're just getting into water bath canning, look that up for your time frames for your particular altitude. But mine's 40 to 45 minutes. Once they're done, I normally let them sit in the water. Turn off the heat, let them sit in the water for a few minutes. Take the jars out, set them on the counter till you'll hear all the popping as they seal. And then I'll take off the bands and double check to make sure I have a good seal on there before I put them away in the basement. But I do take off all the bands while they're stored, and that helps prevent you having a false seal. Because if the band is still on there and it doesn't seal properly, you might not know that if the band's still on there, and if it pops off, doesn't seal, and you go to eat that, it could kill you. So be careful of that. Make sure you got a good seal. So remember I was saying about freezing your tomatoes so that you can preserve them and not have them go bad on you when you don't have time to can, or use them up. Well, I didn't quite take my advice on that this week. I had picked a bunch of these are Chadwick cherry tomatoes, and I should have really, I picked these on Monday. Today's Friday. I should have taken care of these right away because a lot of them were split from heavy rains that we had. And I didn't. I kept putting it off, and they were in here with a bunch of other large tomatoes. And then I come out last night, and there was juice coming out of the bottom of the basket, and a bunch of them had gone bad. And so I cleaned out pretty much all the bad ones last night. But I still have something like that one. My finger just sunk into that. So we'll get rid of that. So I need to go through and get rid of the rest of the bad ones in here. And then pick out what's good still. But, with cherry tomatoes, you can can these too. You can make sauces out of them. Other things way that you can preserve stuff is you don't always have to just can whole tomatoes. You can make tomato juice. You can make salsas. You can make, what else? Salsa and sauce, and can all that kind of stuff. A lot of times cherry tomatoes are good for that kind of thing. But, they're a lot more labor intensive to try to get all the skins off of these. Now you can put them through a food mill if you have one, which will help a lot of your work for that. My food mill, I had made a bunch of flour with from winter wheat that I had grown a few years ago. I made flour out of it, and so I needed take it apart, and I have some kernels and stuff still stuck in there because I haven't really moved or used the food mill since then, and so it's just been sitting in the basement. So I did order a new food mill to use specifically for cherry tomatoes and also our grapes, because I want to dehydrate grapes and make a grapefruit leather out of them. But you need to remove all the seeds and stuff. So I bought a new food mill with an attachment that does all that for you. It's hand cranked, but it does all the other stuff for you. Whereas the one I have downstairs, the attachments won't fit on this particular model. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is I ordered it. I got the attachments for the small stuff, like the cherry tomatoes and grapes, but the food mill itself is back ordered until mid-October, so I won't be using that anytime soon. However, another thing that you can do for preserving your tomatoes, especially when it comes to cherry tomatoes, with something that's maybe not as labor intensive, is dehydrating them and making snacks out of them. That's what I'm going to do with a bunch of these. I'll save some of them for to put on my salads, but the bulk of these I am going to dehydrate. So it's really simple. So all you need to do, just get rid of that little end piece there where the stem was. Just maybe slice it into a couple. I can get 3 out of each one of these. All right. All right, so once you get them all sliced up, put them on one of those silicone trays that you can get either separately, or sometimes they'll even come with the dehydrator that you buy, depending on the model. Then sprinkle with Italian seasoning. You can, use store-bought, or you can use some of your own mix stuff. I don't have a complete mix of my own. This is dried oregano that I have. I've got some dried lemon basil here that I could throw on them if I wanted to. Maybe some dill. Any of those things would work. But the easiest is if you already have a pre-made mix, either of one that you made yourself or from the store, Italian seasoning. Layer them out, make sure that you've got spacing in between each one. And then take your seasoning and just sprinkle on each one. And then repeat as necessary, however many trays you have or want to fill. So once you get your trays filled and get them on those silicone trays, I put them on the silicone because they tend to stick a lot less. If you put them directly on your metal trays that are in some of these different brands of dehydrators, it's going to stick really bad and be a pain to kind of get out of there. The silicone helps reduce the stickage. Also, what you can do is about halfway through is take them out, flip them over, and sometimes that helps as well. And then, put them in for the second half. Anyway, put them in the dehydrator at 125 degrees for a minimum of 6 hours. Normally it takes, depending on how thick your slices are and whatnot, but 6-8 hours at least, and it depends on how dry you want them versus like if you want more of a fruit leather texture to more of a crunchy, like crisp. Is really up to your preference. Now mine aren't quite as crunchy. I do leave a little bit of moisture in there. I mean, they do have crunch, but there might be a little bit of moisture left. And so I keep mine in the fridge. But, ooh, almost lost the whole jar. Anyway, they are a delicious little snack. They're pretty sweet. But with that Italian seasoning, they almost taste like little pizza bites, minus the cheese. But really good little snack. Okay, so that's really about it for a few tips on preserving your tomatoes, freezing, canning, dehydrating. There's a lot of other options that you can do with tomatoes as well to help give you more ways to use them throughout the winter and keep enjoying your harvest until you can start planting again and harvesting again next summer. But things, homemade tomato juice, homemade V8, tomato jelly, tomato pie, I mentioned salsa and sauces, and the list goes on. And there's plenty of different recipes on the old YouTube and various recipe websites. If you use Google, you can look those things up. But keep your options open, look at all the different things that you can do with them, and then finding some of these little tips maybe will give you some ideas or hopefully be helpful to you for things that you can do with your tomatoes. But whatever's going on in your neck of the woods, in your kitchens, in your gardens, greenhouses, whatever it is that you're doing at your homestead or your apartment or wherever it is that you are currently residing, I hope that it is going fantastic for you, and we will see you again soon. Have a great day. Namaste.